The scream that came out of row 14 was not the sound of a child being startled. It was the sound of a child being hurt. And every person within 6 rows of seat 14C felt their stomach drop before they even turned to look. Karen Whitfield's hand was still raised when the flight attendant reached her. In her fingers, tangled and dripping, was the tube of a chemotherapy port, ripped clean from the chest of a 9-year-old girl named Sophie Reyes. Sophie's small hand clutched the raw bleeding skin below her collarbone, her face white with shock, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The blanket that had been covering her lap had slid to the floor, her bald head wrapped in a soft yellow beanie decorated with cartoon stars tipped back against the headrest as tears streamed silently down her cheeks. "She had her feet against my armrest," Karen said, loud enough for the whole cabin to hear, as if volume could make the sentence true. "I told her to move it." I told her. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The recycled cabin air seemed to thicken, and for 3 full seconds, Flight 444 to Denver held its breath. But nobody on that plane knew what was about to happen. Nobody knew that 3 rows behind them, a man in a captain's uniform who had stepped back to check on his daughter one last time before the service cart came through, was now standing frozen in the aisle watching the woman who had just torn a medical device from his little girl's chest. Sophie had been diagnosed 8 months earlier. Osteosarcoma, stage 2, caught during a routine pediatric checkup after weeks of unexplained knee pain that her parents had assumed was just growing pains from soccer practice. The port in her chest, a small disc-shaped device implanted just beneath the skin, was the only thing that made her twice-weekly infusions bearable. Without it, every treatment would mean a fresh needle hunting for a vein that chemotherapy had already made small and fragile and exhausted. Her father, Daniel Reyes, was 44 years old and had been flying commercial aircraft for 19 years. He'd flown medevac helicopters before that, 2 tours, the kind of work that teaches a man to stay calm when everyone else is panicking. He was not working this flight. He was off duty, seated in 17A, escorting his daughter to Denver for a specialized round of treatment at a children's oncology center that had offered her a clinical trial slot other hospitals couldn't. His wife had stayed behind with their younger son. It was supposed to be a quiet trip, just a father and his daughter, and a small green backpack full of coloring books, a stuffed rabbit named Biscuit, and a folder of medical paperwork Daniel had checked and rechecked a dozen times. He was not wearing his uniform. He looked to everyone around him like any other tired dad in an aisle seat. Karen Whitfield looked like exactly what she was, a woman used to getting her way, 49 years old, dressed for first class, even though she was seated in economy after a gate agent had, in her retelling of events later that week, wrongfully denied her an upgrade. She had already complained twice before boarding, once about the boarding order, and once about a flight attendant's tone of voice. She ran a boutique interior design firm in Scottsdale, the kind of business built on referrals and reputation. The kind of business that could not survive what was about to happen to it. She had noticed Sophie's small sock feet resting against the back of her armrest through the gap in the seats, the way children do on long flights when their legs are too short to reach the floor. She had asked, not kindly, for the girl to move. Sophie, weakened from her last round of chemo just 2 days prior, had been slow to respond. Karen had reached through the gap in the seats herself, and in doing so, whether by careless force or something colder, something the passengers nearby would later describe in eerily consistent terms, her hand had closed not on Sophie's leg, but on the thin tube connecting to the port beneath her shirt. "She yanked it," said the woman in 15B, a nurse named Carla Odom, who happened to be seated directly beside Sophie. "I saw the whole thing." That wasn't an accident. That was a woman who didn't care what she was pulling on, as long as it made the kid move. The flight attendant working the aisle, a 12-year veteran named Marcus Webb, arrived within seconds, but seconds were already too many. Blood had soaked through the collar of Sophie's shirt. Her breathing had turned to short, hitching sobs, and Karen Whitfield, instead of stepping back in horror at what she'd done, crossed her arms. "Someone needs to control their child," she said, and that was when everything changed. Daniel Reyes did not shout. He did not lunge. Passengers who watched him move down the aisle described something almost worse than rage. A stillness, a controlled and terrible calm, the look of a man doing math in his head and not liking the answer. He crouched beside his daughter first, only his daughter. He said her name low and steady, checked the wound with the practiced hands of someone who had done combat first aid more times than he could count, and pressed a folded cloth from the seat back pocket against the bleeding with a gentleness that made more than one passenger's eyes fill with tears. "Sophie, baby, look at me. You're okay. Dad's here." Only then did he look up at Karen Whitfield. "Do you know whose port you just pulled out?" he asked her, and his voice did not rise even a single decibel. Karen rolled her eyes. "I don't care whose kid it is. If she can't sit properly, she has cancer," Daniel said. 3 words. The cabin went silent again. That same held breath stillness, thicker this time, heavier. Somewhere near the back, a woman gasped audibly and put a hand to her mouth. Karen's face did something complicated. A flicker of hesitation quickly buried under defensiveness. "That's not my problem." She still shouldn't have had her feet. "You ripped a chemotherapy port out of a 9-year-old's chest," Marcus Webb said, stepping in beside Daniel, his voice shaking with an anger he was struggling to keep professional. "I need you to stop talking and let us help this child." But Karen Whitfield was not a woman who stopped talking. Over the next several minutes, as Marcus radioed the flight deck and a call went out over the PA, asking if any medical professionals were aboard, Karen continued to insist, to justify, to deflect. She told a nearby passenger that kids need boundaries. She told another that she didn't sign up to babysit. She said at one point, loudly enough for a dozen rows to hear, that Sophie's parents should have kept her under control if she was too sick to fly. She did not know that the man kneeling in the aisle, gently rocking his daughter and murmuring reassurances into her yellow beanie, held a Boeing 767 type rating and 11,000 flight hours. She did not know that 4 rows up, an off-duty flight attendant from a different airline was already recording. She did not know that the nurse in 15B was quietly documenting everything on her phone's notes app, timestamps and all, the way she'd been trained to chart in the ER. And she did not know that somewhere above 31,000 FT, 3 separate strangers were about to become witnesses in a case that would end her career, her business, and very nearly her freedom. Carla Odom, the nurse, took over stabilizing the wound while Daniel held his daughter. "It's not deep," she said quietly to him, "but it needs to be looked at as soon as we land. Has she been on blood thinners? Anything that would make this worse?" "She's neutropenic," Daniel said. "Low white count from the last round. Infection risk is." He stopped himself, jaw tightening, and looked down at Sophie's small, trembling hand gripping his sleeve. "It's a real risk. She can't afford to get an infection right now." Sophie, through her tears, managed to whisper the only thing she'd said since it happened. "I didn't mean to be in her way, Daddy." Every adult who heard it felt something crack. Marcus Webb straightened, his face pale with fury he was holding back by sheer professional discipline, and turned to Karen. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat and remain there. This is now a medical and safety incident, and the captain has been notified." "The captain," Karen scoffed loud enough to draw eyes from the rows around her, "for a scraped kid. This is insane. I want to speak to whoever's in charge, because clearly no one on this flight knows how to do their job." Daniel Reyes, still crouched beside his daughter, looked up at her one more time. Something in his expression made Karen's certainty falter for just a second. A flicker gone as fast as it came. "You'll get your wish," he said quietly. "You'll speak to whoever's in charge." For the next 20 minutes, the cabin existed in a strange suspended tension. Sophie had been moved, with Carla's help, into a seat farther from Karen. Propped against pillows, a flight attendant produced from first class without being asked twice. Daniel sat beside her, one hand resting on her small shoulder, his eyes flicking every so often toward the cockpit door. Passengers whispered, phones were held low, recording. A college student in 19C live-streamed a shaky 10-second clip to her friends with the caption, "This woman just heard a kid on my flight and won't stop talking. Someone help!" Karen, for her part, seemed almost energized by the attention. She recounted her version of events to anyone who would half listen. That she'd been assaulted first by a foot against her armrest. That she was the real victim of a family that couldn't control their child. That she'd be filing a complaint the moment they landed. She did not lower her voice. She did not seem to notice that with every sentence she was being recorded by no fewer than 4 different phones. It was Marcus Webb who finally returned down the aisle, this time accompanied by a second flight attendant and a folded slip of paper. He did not go to Karen first. He crouched instead beside Daniel and Sophie, speaking low. "Captain wants a full report the second we're on the ground. He's already radioed ahead." Paramedics will meet us at the gate. He hesitated, glancing toward the cockpit. He also asked me to tell you he's got it from here. Daniel nodded once. A small, tired, grateful nod. Sophie, drowsy now from the adrenaline crash and the steady rhythm of her father's hand on her back, murmured, "Is the plane captain going to be mad?" "No, sweetheart," Daniel said softly. "He's not mad at you, not even a little." What none of the surrounding passengers understood yet, what even Marcus Webb, following protocol, hadn't fully pieced together, was that the captain flying flight 444 that day was not simply notified of an in-flight incident. He had been personally reached, mid-flight by name, because the man on the ground. Dispatch desk recognized exactly whose daughter had just been hurt in economy class. Daniel Reyes was not just any passenger. He was a training captain for the Airline, one of the most respected in the fleet. The kind of pilot young first officers requested to fly with specifically because of his calm under pressure. And the woman currently in command of the aircraft, Captain Elena Vasquez, had trained under him herself 6 years earlier, back when she was a nervous first officer learning to fly wide-body jets. She had not hesitated for a second when dispatch relayed what happened. Karen Whitfield, still seated, still complaining, still utterly unaware, would not learn any of this until the plane was on the ground. But something in the air had shifted. The flight attendants no longer treated her with the deferential patience owed to any paying passenger. Their eyes had gone flat, professional, and distant. A woman 2 rows back had stopped filming and started crying quietly instead, overwhelmed by the sight of the little girl's bandaged chest and exhausted, tear-streaked face. And Carla Odom, the nurse, sat with her phone in her lap, her documentation nearly complete, waiting. The descent into Denver began 40 minutes later. Sophie slept against her father's arm, Biscuit the stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her chin. A strip of gauze taped carefully over the wound at her collarbone. Daniel did not sleep. He watched the seat back in front of him with the stillness of a man replaying every second of what had happened, filing it away with the same precision he used to review checklists before takeoff. Karen, 3 rows away, had gone quiet at last. Not out of remorse, passengers would later say, but boredom. She'd pulled out a paperback and begun reading as though nothing at all had happened, as though a child's blood hadn't been on her hand less than an hour earlier. She did not know that when the wheels touched down, 2 Denver police officers and a full paramedic crew would already be waiting at the gate. She did not know that Daniel Reyes had, in a brief and quiet conversation with Marcus Webb during the descent, formally requested that local authorities meet the flight, not as an off-duty father making a complaint, but as a captain of the airline, invoking the full weight of company protocol for an assault on a passenger, a minor, during flight. And she certainly did not know that the moment the aircraft reached the gate and the seatbelt sign switched off, the cockpit door would open and Captain Elena Vasquez, a decorated 12-year veteran of the airline, sharp-eyed and unsmiling in her full uniform, would walk directly down the aisle past dozens of passengers and stop at row 14. "Ma'am," Captain Vasquez said, her voice carrying easily through the hushed cabin, "I need you to remain in your seat. You are not permitted to deplane until law enforcement has spoken with you." Karen looked up from her book, indignant. "Excuse me, on what grounds?" "On the grounds," the captain said evenly, "that you assaulted a 9-year-old cancer patient and damaged a medical device implanted in her chest in front of 40 witnesses, several of whom recorded the incident. That child is the daughter of one of this airline's most senior training captains, currently seated 3 rows behind you. He has already filed a formal report. The police are waiting at the gate." The color drained from Karen Whitfield's face so completely that the woman beside her would later describe it as watching someone turn to stone in real time. That's not, I didn't know she was," Karen stammered, her voice climbing an octave, all her earlier bravado collapsing at once. "Nobody told me who she was. Would it have mattered?" Daniel Reyes asked quietly from 3 rows back, his daughter's small hand still resting in his. Would it have mattered if she was nobody's daughter but her own? The cabin erupted. Not in cheers, not yet, but in a low, rolling murmur of disbelief and vindication. Dozens of passengers who had watched this unfold finally allowed to exhale. Somewhere near the back, someone began to clap, slow and uncertain at first, and then it spread row by row until the sound filled the plane. Karen Whitfield did not clap. Karen Whitfield sat frozen in her seat, paperback forgotten in her lap, as 2 uniformed police officers, stepped through the aircraft door and began making their way down the aisle toward her. What happened over the following hour unfolded with the particular grinding inevitability of consequences finally catching up to someone who had spent her whole life outrunning them. The officers took statements first from Marcus Webb, then from Carla Odom, whose time-stamped notes and photographs of the injury became the backbone of the report. Other passengers, including the college student who'd live-streamed the moment, volunteered their footage without being asked twice. By the time Karen was formally read her rights and led off the aircraft in handcuffs, a sight that drew a fresh, quieter round of applause from the remaining passengers. The airline's corporate security office had already been notified, and a report was en route to both the Denver Police Department and the airline's legal team. Sophie was carried off the plane not in handcuffs, but in her father's arms. Met at the gate by paramedics who redressed her wound properly and confirmed with visible relief that the port itself hadn't fully torn from beneath the skin. Only its external tubing, which could be surgically reattached at the hospital with minimal additional trauma if treated quickly. It still meant an emergency procedure. It still meant Sophie's Denver hospital stay would begin 12 hours earlier than planned and with far more pain than anyone had wanted for her. But she was safe, and she was breathing. And her father did not let go of her hand once. Not through the ambulance ride, not through the ER triage, not through the hours spent waiting on tenterhooks in a curtain bay while a pediatric surgeon assessed the damage. Karen Whitfield's next 72 hours unraveled with the swift, merciless efficiency of the modern internet. The college student's video, already public before the plane had even landed, had accumulated over 4 million views by the following morning. News outlets picked up the story by afternoon. Her design firm's Instagram page, once full of curated photos of Scottsdale living rooms and tasteful marble countertops, was flooded overnight with thousands of comments demanding accountability, tagging former clients, tagging local news stations. 2 clients publicly canceled ongoing contracts within hours. A local news affiliate ran the story that evening under the headline, "Passenger charged after ripping medical device from child with cancer mid-flight." And by the next morning, Karen Whitfield's name, along with her business, her photo, and a screenshot of her mid-flight tirade, had become inescapable across social media. The airline suspended her from future travel on their carrier permanently within 24 hours. Denver prosecutors reviewing the mounting evidence, video footage from 4 separate angles, a nurse's contemporaneous documentation, a police report, and medical records confirming the injury, filed charges of felony child abuse and reckless endangerment, elevated from what might otherwise have been a simple assault charge, specifically because of Sophie's compromised immune system and the documented risk the open wound posed to a chemotherapy patient. Karen's attorney, in a statement to local media, said only that his client regretted the incident and looked forward to resolving the matter privately. A statement that did little to slow the storm, since by then 3 additional witnesses had come forward, describing a pattern. 2 previous incidents at other Scottsdale, businesses where Karen had been asked to leave after aggressive confrontations with staff. Sophie's surgery to repair the port went smoothly. She began her clinical trial infusions 2 days later than scheduled, but without further complication. And doctors told Daniel and his wife, who had flown out the following morning, that the delay had not meaningfully affected her treatment window. Captain Elena Vasquez visited Sophie in the hospital before her return flight to Phoenix, bringing a stuffed Model 767 signed by the flight crew and a card that read, in careful handwriting, "You're the bravest passenger I've ever flown. Get well soon and come see the cockpit next time. No turbulence. Promise." Daniel Reyes gave one brief statement to a local reporter outside the hospital, the only public comment he made throughout the entire ordeal. He did not mention his rank. He did not mention his flight hours or his years of service. He said only this: "My daughter has spent 8 months fighting something most adults couldn't survive with the grace she has. She didn't deserve 1 more second of pain from anyone, least of all a stranger who decided her comfort mattered less than an armrest. I hope this reminds people that you never know who you're sitting next to, and it shouldn't matter." Kindness should have been enough on its own. The clip of that statement was viewed more than the original video within a week. Karen Whitfield's design firm closed its doors permanently 2 months later, unable to recover from the loss of clients and the relentless public scrutiny. She accepted a plea agreement rather than face trial, resulting in a felony conviction. a period of supervised probation, mandatory community service at a pediatric health nonprofit, an irony not lost on a single person following the case, and a civil settlement with the Reyes family that Daniel quietly donated in full to the Children's Oncology Center treating his daughter. Sophie Reyes finished her clinical trial round 11 months after the flight. Her latest scans, according to a brief update her mother posted to a family blog the following spring, showed no evidence of disease. She went back to soccer practice that summer, knee brace and all, and the last photo on that blog showed her mid-stride on a green field, hair beginning to grow back in soft, dark tufts beneath a headband. Biscuit, the stuffed rabbit, tucked into the pocket of a bag on the sideline. There is a version of this story where the lesson is simply that cruelty finds its consequences, that the universe has a way of settling its accounts. But the truer lesson, the one Daniel Reyes tried to offer in his single quiet statement outside a Denver hospital, was smaller and harder than that. It never should have taken a captain's daughter, a viral video, or a felony charge for a 9-year-old girl in a yellow beanie to be treated with basic human decency. It should have been enough on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at 31,000 FT that she was just a child. That should have been the only fact that mattered.